Photography has always been more than a job for me. It's been a way to understand people, to see them fully, sometimes even more clearly than they see themselves. But recently, I'd begun to notice something strange in my photos. Something I couldn't explain, yet couldn't ignore. It started with a routine shoot. A young musician had hired me for new promotional photos, something raw and intense, capturing the passion he poured into his work. We had an incredible session, him fully present, energy and emotion pouring out with every shot. I knew the photos would be good, I could feel it. But as I was developing the negatives later that evening, I noticed a faint, almost invisible shadow hovering near him in every frame. At first, I assumed it was a lighting glitch, a defect in the lens, or maybe some dust on the film. But as I examined each print under the soft red glow of the darkroom, I realized that the shadow was there, consistent and unsettlingly familiar. It wasn't exactly around him. It seemed to hover over his shoulder, like a presence watching him closely. The next day, I pulled out some older photos from past shoots, carefully studying each print. I hadn't noticed it before, but I saw the same shadow, faint but unmistakable, in so many of them. The shadow was especially vivid in photos taken during emotionally charged moments, people in the midst of laughter, sorrow, anger. It was as if the camera had captured something beyond the physical, something hidden but real. I spent hours scrutinizing my work, my mind racing with a blend of curiosity and unease. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was simply an artifact, an imperfection in the film. But it didn't explain the consistency, the way the shadow seemed almost alive, responding to the emotions of each subject. The discovery should have thrilled me. After all, every artist dreams of finding something unique, something no one else has captured before. But instead, I felt a cold knot of fear forming in my chest, a suspicion I didn't want to acknowledge. As the evening wore on, I grew more restless, haunted by the images staring back at me from the prints scattered across my work table. I remembered something my first photography mentor had told me years ago. Photography is about seeing the invisible, capturing what the eye misses. At the time, I thought he meant the small details, expressions, movements, glances that people might not notice. But now, the words took on a different meaning, as though I were seeing something truly invisible, something not meant to be seen at all. I tried to push the thought aside, telling myself I was overreacting, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. But even as I packed up for the night, the shadows lingered, following me in silence, an unanswered question that refused to let me go. Over the next few days, the feeling only grew. Every photo I took, every print I developed, seemed to carry a piece of something more than the person's face, as if I'd inadvertently reached past their skin and captured something deeper. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, a pattern I'd fabricated out of overwork, or maybe just the pressure to create something extraordinary. But then, the comments started. Clients reached out, each describing a feeling of exhaustion or heaviness after their sessions. One woman emailed me, saying she felt off since the shoot, like she'd left a piece of herself in my studio. Another person, an actor I'd photographed multiple times, asked if I'd felt a strange emptiness when taking his photos, as if I'd taken something from him beyond his image. It wasn't until a friend of mine, Greg, a fellow photographer who often helped me with lighting and setup, brought it up that I realized how far the feeling extended. I'd asked him to sit for a few test shots while I was adjusting new lighting, just a quick favor that shouldn't have meant much. But as soon as I lowered the camera, he looked at me, his face pale and his brows furrowed. "Did you feel that?" he asked, rubbing his arms as if he were cold. "It's like something's been sucked out of me." He forced a laugh, but his unease was clear. "Doesn't that ever happen to you? The feeling you're, I don't know, taking something more than just a picture?" I tried to brush it off, telling him he was overthinking it, but his question stuck with me. Did I feel it? There had always been a strange sensation when I looked through the lens, a feeling of connection, of reaching into the moment and pulling something unique out. But I'd always assumed it was just the thrill of capturing a powerful image. Now I was no longer so sure. That night, alone in my dark room, I went through dozens of old photos, studying them with a scrutiny I hadn't applied before. The shadows I'd once dismissed as tricks of the light now took on a new significance. In some photos they were subtle, faint enough to overlook, but in others they were almost solid, a dark shape looming close to the person's face or shoulders, barely noticeable unless you knew to look. I could almost feel the weight of each one, the way the shadow clung to the image like a memory, something tied to the person's very essence. And the more I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't an illusion or a fluke. These shadows were real, and they were only there because I'd put them there. I set the photos down, a cold shiver running through me. The pattern was undeniable now, each shadow a ghostly mark on the lives of people I'd photographed. I wanted to believe it was harmless, that it was just an unusual quirk of my camera or my technique, but deep down, I knew better. These shadows were pieces of people, fragments of their lives, captured in a way that no one else seemed able to replicate. The revelation terrified me as much as it fascinated me. The idea of capturing more than just a face, of preserving some hidden essence, was exhilarating. But what was the cost? My subjects were feeling drained, altered in ways I couldn't explain, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was responsible. I considered quitting, putting down the camera for good, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. There was something addictive about the power, the knowledge that I could capture something others couldn't. And though I tried to push the thought away, I knew that part of me was drawn to it, curious to see just how deep this gift, or curse, could go. Yet as I turned off the dark room lights and locked the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced back, half expecting to see a figure in the darkness, one of the shadows from the photos come to life, silently accusing me. But there was nothing, only the silent weight of the photos I'd left behind, waiting for me to return. It was almost a relief when Lily Winters walked into my studio a few days later. I hadn't heard from her in years. She was someone I'd photographed early in my career, back when my work was less intense, more straightforward. She'd always had an air of mystery, her eyes dark and distant, as if carrying secrets she had no intention of revealing. She looked the same as I remembered, though something in her eyes seemed heavier now. We made small talk for a while, catching up, and she mentioned she'd heard rumors about my work, whispers in certain circles about how my photos were different, that they captured something more. "I want you to photograph me again," she said, her gaze holding mine. "There's a part of me I don't want to lose, a part I need to see, to hold on to, and I think you're the only one who can capture it." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I could see it in her face. She meant it. She believed in whatever rumors she'd heard, trusted that I could somehow reach into her and preserve something she was afraid to lose. I hesitated, my mind flashing back to the shadows, to the people who'd described feeling drained after their sessions. but I couldn't turn her down. Curiosity, and I'll admit, a strange excitement got the better of me. We started the session that evening. Lily was completely vulnerable in front of the lens, letting every emotion rise to the surface. Her face shifted from sadness to defiance, moments of warmth melting into intense, almost haunting stillness. Each click of the shutter felt like a pulse, a heartbeat connecting us. I felt as if I were drawing something out of her, something deep and intangible. As the session came to an end, she held my gaze, her expression softened. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet fear, or maybe sadness. She didn't say anything, just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as though acknowledging something we both felt but didn't fully understand. After she left, I returned to the dark room, eager to see what I'd captured. As the images began to appear on the paper, my breath caught. The photos of Lily were unlike anything I'd ever taken. The shadow I'd grown accustomed to seeing was there, but it was no longer faint or distant. It was defined, almost vivid, as if it had taken on a life of its own. In one photo, it seemed to hover directly over her shoulder, reaching toward her with a dark, skeletal hand. But it was the last photo that disturbed me most. Her face was in focus, her expression soft and reflective, but the shadow wasn't a separate entity anymore. It seemed to be inside her, an outline of darkness just beneath her skin, faint yet undeniably present, like a second soul living within her. A chill ran through me, and I felt my hands tremble as I held the print. This wasn't just a quirk of lighting or an artifact on the film. It was something real, something that had been there, hidden beneath the surface. The camera had revealed it, brought it to life. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Her eyes filled with something unspoken, something desperate. And each time, the shadow appeared, watching me from the edges of my mind, like it knew something I didn't. For the next few days, I couldn't get the images out of my head. I found myself drawn to the photo of Lily, returning to it over and over, as if it held an answer to a question I didn't know how to ask. The shadow, now unmistakable, seemed almost to breathe, like it was alive, waiting for me to understand its meaning. Then one night, I dreamt of her. In the dream, she was standing in the dark, her face pale, her eyes filled with the same haunting sadness from our last session. She reached out to me, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Daniel, please, let me go." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The words echoed in my mind, a plea that felt more real than any dream. I lay there in the darkness, feeling a presence in the room with me, the same cold, silent weight that had haunted my photos. Lily's words left me with a terrifying thought. What if the shadow wasn't just a trick of the light or a fluke of my technique? What if, in capturing her image, I had trapped a part of her, pulled something out that was now locked in the photograph? The idea was absurd, impossible, but I couldn't shake it. Her face, her voice, her shadow followed me, a silent reminder of something I couldn't understand and couldn't ignore. I knew I had to find out more. I had to confront the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be, because now it wasn't just about photography or art. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond anything I had ever known. And I could feel it waiting for me, hidden in the shadows, daring me to look closer. The unease had grown into something unbearable. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, filling every corner of my studio. The faces from my photographs seemed to follow me, their shadows darkening with each glance, their eyes haunted by a pain that hadn't been there before. But it was Lily's image that haunted me the most. Her face, stared back at me with a pleading, almost desperate expression, and I knew that something in that photograph was alive. Over the next few nights, the visions and dreams grew worse. I could hardly sleep, each attempt to rest interrupted by images of Lily or by shadows creeping along the walls. I began to hear whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. They echoed through my apartment, filling the silence with voices that sounded distant but familiar. I knew these voices. They were the murmurs of the people I'd photographed, each one layered over the next, a chorus of disembodied pleas. One night, as I sat alone in my studio, the air grew colder, and a strange feeling washed over me. It was the same sensation I'd felt during the photo sessions, but now it was stronger, almost suffocating. I turned, and there, in the dim light, I saw them, shadows taking shape, forming figures that I recognized instantly. They were my subjects, the people I had photographed over the years, their faces twisted with sadness and accusation. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as they stepped closer. Their voices filled the room, each one overlapping, rising into a cacophony of despair. "You took something from us," one of them whispered, his voice like a distant echo. "Give it back," another voice pleaded, her face barely visible in the darkness, her eyes filled with something I couldn't bear to look at. And then, in the center of them all, was Lily. She stepped forward, her face pale, her eyes filled with the same sorrow and fear I'd seen in my dream. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you have to release us." Her words hit me like a blow. I wanted to tell her I didn't know how, that I hadn't meant to trap anyone, that I hadn't even known I was capable of it. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd felt it in every photo, sensed it in every shadow. Somehow, I had taken something from each of them, an essence, a piece of their spirit that was now trapped within the photographs. Desperate, I stumbled to the cabinet where I kept my oldest and most prized prints. I rifled through the stacks of images, my hands shaking as I realized that each one was marked by that shadow, a piece of them lingering in the frame. And with each photo, I felt the weight grow heavier, a silent accusation that I couldn't escape. I knew what I had to do. Grabbing the photos, I set them in a pile in the middle of the room. My hands trembled as I struck a match, the flame flickering in the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the photographs, as if reaching for freedom. As I lowered the match, the flame caught, and the photos began to burn. The room filled with the acrid smell of smoke, and the shadows around me seemed to pulse, their shapes shifting as the photos curled and blackened in the fire. The voices grew louder, rising into a haunting wail as the flames consumed the images. I could feel their anger, their pain, their desperation, all of it pouring out as the photos burned. And as the last of the images turned to ash, the shadows around me began to fade, their voices trailing off into silence. Finally, only Lily remained, her figure faint, almost transparent. She looked at me, her expression softening, a sadness in her eyes that I couldn't fully understand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then she was gone, her form dissolving into the darkness, leaving me alone in the silence. As the last embers of the fire died, I sank to the floor, exhausted, my mind reeling from what I had just done. The shadows were gone, the voices silenced, but the weight of what I had seen, of what I had unknowingly done, remained. I looked around the empty studio, feeling a strange emptiness settle over me. The shadows were gone, but they had left something behind. A silence that felt almost sacred, a reminder of the power I'd wielded and the lives I had touched. As I sat there in the dark, I knew that my gift, or curse, had finally been lifted. I was free, but at a cost I could hardly comprehend. The days after I burned the photos passed in a haze. For the first time in years, my studio felt like an ordinary room. No shadows lurking in the corners, no whispers slipping through the silence. Yet, as much as the absence of those presences should have comforted me, I felt hollow, as though I'd lost something profound. I hadn't picked up my camera since that night. The thought of capturing another image, of potentially taking another piece of someone, filled me with a quiet dread. I used to believe photography was about connection, about preserving a part of life's essence. But now, all I saw was the potential to harm, to imprison. I spent hours each day sorting through the remnants of my career, images that were now only images, empty of that strange, dark life they'd once held. Yet I knew I couldn't bring myself to destroy all of them. There was one photo I hadn't burned, a single image tucked away in a drawer, one of the first portraits I'd taken with my oldest camera. One evening, unable to resist, I took it out. The photo showed a young woman I'd met by chance, a friend of a friend, her face lit with genuine joy. She'd been happy that day, carefree, and in the photograph, she looked alive. I examined it closely, searching for a shadow, for any trace of what I'd once seen in my other images. But there was nothing, just a moment frozen in time, untouched by the strange curse that had once plagued my work. And yet, as I stared, I felt a twinge of doubt, a hint of something just beyond my understanding. In the far corner of the photo, where the light faded into darkness, there was the faintest impression, a smudge, almost too subtle to see. I wanted to dismiss it, to believe it was just an imperfection, a trick of my mind. But as I held the photo, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, a piece of me remained bound to this strange gift. I put the photograph away, tucking it back into the drawer, a silent reminder of what I'd lost and what I'd given up to break free. The shadows were gone, the voices silenced, but the memory of them remained, a whisper from the past, a reminder of the power that once lived within my camera. And as I closed the drawer, I knew that I was done with photography, at least for now. My gift had given me a glimpse into something extraordinary and terrible, a brush with the soul itself. I couldn't risk capturing another life, trapping another soul in a prison they didn't deserve. It was better this way. I left the studio that night, feeling the cool air wash over me, a fresh start. For the first time in a long while, I felt free.